Jake adjusted his tie, feeling completely out of place. It wasn't the usual kind of tie you'd wear to a fancy dinner. This one had been handed to him by a sentient coat rack at the entrance. The thing wriggled around his neck like a living snake and changed colors every few seconds, much to his discomfort. This wasn't Earth. This wasn't even close. He had willingly entered the cosmic mirage, the galaxy's most infamous nightclub, and he already regretted it. The place was a sensory overload. Neon lights pulsed in every color of the visible spectrum, and a few Jake was pretty sure human eyes weren't designed to see. Gravity fluctuated at random intervals, making dancers float elegantly one moment and crash back to the ground the next. One alien performer with 6 arms spun herself into a glowing cocoon while patrons showered her with what looked like bioluminescent jelly beans. The smell of fried tentacles and sweet, acidic vapors hung in the air. Jake coughed, trying not to breathe too deeply. He wasn't here for fun. He'd only come because his friend, a shady intergalactic travel blogger, had dared him to experience authentic nightlife on the Outer Rim. Authentic, Jake decided, was just another word for absolutely insane. He made his way toward the bar, dodging an alien with 3 heads who seemed to be arguing with itself over a spilled drink. "What'll it be, Terran?" asked the bartender, a metallic-skinned being with eyes that glowed like miniature suns. It cleaned a glass with what appeared to be a living rag that occasionally whimpered. Something mild?" Jake ventured, not entirely sure how alien beverages worked. The bartender handed him a drink that hissed ominously. Jake eyed it warily but decided it would be rude not to take a sip. The liquid bubbled down his throat and immediately made his left arm feel like it was vibrating. "Not bad," he muttered, setting the glass down. He turned to watch the stage. That's when he saw her. She moved like liquid fire, her bioluminescent skin shimmering with every step. Her limbs, impossibly long and elegant, stretched in ways that made Jake question everything he knew about physics. She was an alien, obviously, humanoid enough to be mesmerizing, but with features that marked her as something distinctly other. Her skin glowed a soft purple, and faint, translucent wings fluttered behind her. The crowd was transfixed, and Jake was no exception. He didn't even realize he was staring until she turned and locked eyes with him. Her gaze was sharp, playful, and predatory all at once. Jake gulped. "You look like trouble," she said, her voice somehow reaching him over the pounding bass of the music. Jake tried to reply, but his brain short-circuited. All he managed was an awkward thumbs-up, which only made her smirk. She turned her back to him and continued her routine, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching him. A hand clapped down on his shoulder, making him jump. It was the coat rack from earlier, or at least, something that looked like it. "No touching the performers," it warned in a mechanical voice, even though Jake had done nothing of the sort. "Wasn't planning to," he muttered, brushing the thing off. The night wore on, and Jake found himself nursing his strange drink, trying to ignore the vibrating sensation in his arm. He was just about to leave when a loud crash echoed through the club. A drink tray had fallen, or rather, it had been knocked over by a very drunk, very large alien with tentacles for legs. The alien swayed dangerously, bumping into tables and patrons as it stumbled toward the stage. Jake didn't think. Maybe it was the drink, or maybe it was sheer stupidity, but he moved without hesitation. He leapt forward, trying to stop the alien from colliding with the performer. What he didn't anticipate was the stage's gravity field fluctuating just as he jumped. He missed the alien entirely and landed flat on the stage, right at the dancer's feet. The crowd erupted in laughter, and Jake wanted to crawl into a hole and die. Before he could even apologize, she grabbed him by the collar and hauled him to his feet. "What are you doing?" she hissed, her glowing skin dimming slightly in irritation. "Trying to, help," Jake stammered, realizing how ridiculous he must look. "Congratulations," she said dryly. "You just ruined my routine." Before Jake could respond, the tentacled alien crashed into the stage, spilling what looked like glowing tar everywhere. Jake stumbled backward, his foot slipping in the goo. He grabbed for something, anything, to steady himself, and his hand landed on the dancer's arm. That was when the real trouble began. The goo wasn't just sticky, it was some kind of alien adhesive, and it worked instantly. Jake's hand was now firmly attached to the dancer's arm, and no amount of tugging would free it. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," she groaned, trying to pull away. Jake winced. "This isn't my fault." "Really?" "Because it feels like your fault," she shot back, glaring at him. The crowd roared with laughter as the two of them struggled, their awkward dance quickly becoming the night's main attraction. Even the DJ seemed to be enjoying it, switching the music to a comical tune that only made the situation more absurd. "Okay, new plan," she said, her tone sharp. "We're getting off this stage, and you're explaining what the hell you're doing here." "Gladly," Jake said, his face burning with embarrassment. But as they tried to step down, the goo's adhesive properties kicked in even more. With every move, it seemed to bind them closer together. By the time they reached the edge of the stage, they were practically glued shoulder to shoulder. "Great," she muttered. "Just great." Jake opened his mouth to apologize, but before he could say a word, the bouncer, a hulking alien with 4 glowing eyes, stepped forward. "New rule," the bouncer said, his deep voice rumbling through the club. "If you're stuck, you're staying stuck." The crowd cheered, and Jake realized this night was far from over. Jake winced as he tried to pull his hand free, but the adhesive wasn't just sticky, it was stubborn. Every tug only seemed to make it worse, like some kind of cruel joke. Lixa, as the dancer introduced herself through gritted teeth, was far less amused. "Stop pulling, human! You're making it worse!" she snapped, her glowing skin pulsing faintly as she glared at him. "I'm not pulling. I'm trying to unstick," Jake replied weakly, realizing how absurd he sounded. "Yeah, great plan," Lixa said, rolling her eyes. "Because that's been working so well so far." Jake sighed, his face flushing as a few patrons passed by, pointing and laughing. Lixa's irritation only seemed to grow as she scanned the crowd, clearly not enjoying being the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. "This is a disaster," she muttered. "Do you have any idea how expensive that performance adhesive is? And now it's wasted. On you." "Performance adhesive?" Jake asked, his eyebrows raising. Lixa gave him a withering look. "Yes. It's supposed to enhance my act, not glue me to some bumbling human who can't stay in his seat." "Well, excuse me for trying to help," Jake shot back. "That alien with the tentacle legs was about to plow through the stage. I thought you might, I don't know, appreciate not getting squashed." Lixa paused, her expression softening ever so slightly, but the irritation didn't leave her voice. "Fine. Points for effort. But now we're stuck together, and I've got a schedule to keep." Jake blinked. "A schedule? What kind of schedule involves industrial-grade adhesive?" "Not your business," she said sharply, tugging at her arm. "But here's the short version. I have places to be, and you're coming along whether you like it or not." "Wait, what?" No, I have my own, things," Jake stammered. "I can't just—" "You're already here, genius," Lixa cut him off, gesturing to their fused limbs. "Unless you've got some magic solvent in those pockets, you're part of this now." Jake groaned, looking down at their stuck arms. "This can't be happening. There's gotta be a way to—" "No time," Lixa interrupted. "We need to move. Now." Before Jake could argue, Lixa yanked him forward, nearly pulling him off his feet. Despite her slender frame, she was surprisingly strong. Jake stumbled after her as she navigated through the crowded nightclub, muttering apologies every time their awkward movement knocked into someone. "You could at least warn me before dragging me around," Jake complained. "Don't have time for manners," Lixa said, glancing over her shoulder. "If we're lucky, we can fix this before—" Her words were cut off by a loud, metallic crash. Jake turned to see a group of armored aliens forcing their way into the club. They were tall and intimidating, with glowing visors and weapons that hummed ominously. "Oh, great. Them," Lixa muttered. "Who's them?" Jake asked, his voice rising with panic. Bounty hunters, Lixa said flatly. And they're here for me. Jake's stomach dropped. Why are bounty hunters after you? Also not your business, she replied. Just keep moving. Not my, are you kidding me? I'm glued to you. This is absolutely my business now. Lixa ignored him, pulling him toward a side exit. Jake stumbled along, trying to keep up. Behind them, the bounty hunters were shoving their way through the crowd, their glowing visors scanning the room. Okay, new question, Jake said breathlessly. What's the plan here? Plan? Survive, Lixa said. And maybe get unstuck if we live long enough. Fantastic, Jake muttered. Great plan. They reached the exit just as one of the bounty hunters spotted them. A loud, mechanical voice echoed through the club. Target identified. Capture on sight. Jake didn't have time to process the words before Lixa shoved him through the door, dragging him into a narrow alley behind the club. The air outside was colder, filled with the faint hum of alien machinery and distant voices. Okay, this is insane, Jake said, trying to catch his breath. You're a dancer, why are bounty hunters after you? Lixa shot him an annoyed look. Do I look like a regular dancer to you? Jake hesitated, remembering the way she moved on stage, the strange glow of her skin, and now the bounty hunters. Fair point. So, what's the deal? Smuggling? Espionage? Are you some kind of intergalactic spy? Lixa didn't answer right away, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed. Smuggling. And let's leave it at that. Jake threw his free hand in the air. Great. Just great. I'm stuck to an intergalactic smuggler being chased by bounty hunters. This is exactly how I wanted my night to go. You think I wanted this? Lixa shot back. You're the idiot who fell on stage and got us into this mess. Jake opened his mouth to argue but stopped when he saw the bounty hunters emerging from the club. Lixa cursed under her breath, grabbing Jake and pulling him into the shadows. Stay quiet, she whispered. Yeah, because that's easy when you're glued to someone, Jake muttered, but he followed her lead. The bounty hunters scanned the alley, their visors glowing ominously. Lixa held her breath, her glowing skin dimming as she tried to blend into the shadows. Jake did his best to stay still, but the adhesive made it impossible to find a comfortable position. After what felt like an eternity, the bounty hunters moved on, their heavy footsteps fading into the distance. Lixa let out a breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Okay, she said. We need to get to my ship. It's the only place we'll be safe. Your ship? What happened to getting unstuck first? Jake asked. One problem at a time, she said, tugging at his arm. Come on. Jake groaned but followed her lead. As they made their way through the maze-like streets of the alien city, he couldn't help but wonder what he'd gotten himself into. One thing was clear, this night was far from over. Jake stumbled as Lixa dragged him through the twisting alleys of the alien city. The adhesive had somehow made their movements more awkward, forcing them into an ungainly shuffle. Every time Jake tried to steady himself, the bond seemed to pull them even closer, like it was actively mocking them. You really don't have a plan, do you? Jake asked, his voice laced with exasperation. Of course I have a plan, Lixa shot back. It's just evolving. Oh, great. Love a plan that evolves mid-chaos, Jake muttered. That's super reassuring. Lixa stopped abruptly, and Jake nearly crashed into her. She turned, her glowing eyes narrowing. Do you ever stop talking? Jake opened his mouth to reply, but she cut him off. Look, we're stuck together, literally. I don't like it either, but if you want to get out of this alive, you're going to have to trust me. Trust you? Jake raised an eyebrow. You're a smuggler with bounty hunters on your tail. Forgive me if you don't exactly scream trustworthy. Lixa sighed, her glow dimming slightly as if the situation were draining her. Fair. But your other option is to sit here and wait for them to find us. And trust me, you don't want to see what they'll do to you. Humans are worth a lot on the black market. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Fine. Lead the way. They continued through the maze of alleys, dodging the occasional patrolling drone. The city was alive with strange sounds, buzzing lights, mechanical hums, and the distant chatter of alien languages. Jake couldn't help but feel out of his depth. He'd traveled to a few alien worlds before, but he'd never been in a situation like this. As they turned another corner, Jake's curiosity got the better of him. So, what exactly are you smuggling? Lixa gave him a sidelong glance. Why do you care? Because I'd like to know why I'm risking my life, Jake said. You know, since I didn't exactly sign up for this. Lixa hesitated before answering, her voice low. It's an artifact. Something valuable. Dangerous. Jake's stomach tightened. Dangerous how? Let's just say the people chasing us aren't the only ones who want it, she said. And if it falls into the wrong hands, it could cause problems. Define problems, Jake pressed. Big problems, she said vaguely, her tone making it clear she wasn't in the mood to elaborate. Jake groaned. Fantastic. So, not only am I glued to you, but I'm also involved in some kind of intergalactic heist. This just keeps getting better. Lixa smirked. Glad you're finally catching on. They reached what looked like a bustling market square, the neon lights casting strange shadows across the cobblestone streets. Vendors shouted in alien tongues, their stalls overflowing with bizarre wares, everything from glowing fruit to jars filled with wriggling, multicolored worms. Jake tried not to make eye contact with anyone, but it was hard not to stare. Lixa navigated the crowd with practiced ease, her movements smooth despite the awkward tether binding them. Jake, on the other hand, was less graceful. He tripped over an alien child's tail and knocked into a stall, sending a stack of floating orbs tumbling to the ground. Sorry! He exclaimed, his face flushing as the vendor glared at him. Could you be any more conspicuous? Lixa hissed, pulling him along. Not my fault your marketplace doesn't come with safety rails, Jake snapped. Their argument was cut short by a loud mechanical voice. Targets located. Initiating capture protocol. Jake whipped his head around to see the bounty hunters pushing their way through the crowd, their glowing visors scanning the area. Oh, great. They found us, he said, his voice tinged with panic. Run! Lixa shouted, yanking him forward. They bolted through the market, weaving between stalls and dodging startled shoppers. The adhesive made every movement awkward, forcing them to stay in sync. Jake couldn't help but notice the absurdity of the situation. Here he was, running for his life while glued to an alien dancer who moonlighted as a smuggler. It would have been funny if it weren't so terrifying. The bounty hunters were relentless, their heavy footsteps echoing behind them. One of them raised a weapon, and a burst of energy sizzled past Jake's head, narrowly missing him. Do they have to shoot at us? Jake yelled. They're not big on subtlety, Lixa replied, dragging him around a corner. They ducked into a narrow alley, the walls so close that Jake could feel the cool metal against his shoulder. Lixa pulled him into a recessed doorway, her glowing skin dimming to blend with the shadows. Stay still, she whispered. Jake held his breath as the bounty hunters passed by, their visors glowing ominously in the dim light. One of them paused, scanning the area. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel Lixa tense beside him. After a few agonizing seconds, the hunter moved on. Once the coast was clear, Lixa exhaled, her glow returning to its normal intensity. That was too close. No kidding, Jake muttered. What now? We need to get out of the city, Lixa said. My ship is parked at a docking bay on the outskirts. If we can make it there, we'll be safe. Jake frowned. And how exactly are we supposed to get there without being spotted? Lixa smirked. Leave that to me. Jake didn't like the sound of that, but he didn't have much choice. As Lixa led him through the winding alleys, he couldn't help but wonder what he'd gotten himself into. This wasn't the adventure he'd signed up for, but there was no turning back now. Jake's legs were starting to ache as Lixa continued to pull him through the labyrinthine streets of the alien city. Every few steps, the adhesive seemed to tighten, making their already awkward movements even more ridiculous. He gritted his teeth, trying to focus on keeping up, but the absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on him. "You know," Jake said, panting slightly, "for someone who claims to have a plan, you don't seem very organized. Do you always talk this much?" Lixa shot back without looking at him. "Only when I'm stuck to a stranger who's dragging me through an alien city while bounty hunters are trying to kill us," Jake quipped. "So yeah, pretty rare." Lixa snorted, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "You're lucky I don't leave you behind." "Not sure that's an option," Jake muttered, gesturing to their stuck arms. They rounded another corner, and Lixa suddenly stopped, pulling Jake into the shadows of an alcove. He stumbled slightly, bumping into her. She shot him a glare but didn't say anything. Instead, she leaned out, her glowing eyes scanning the street ahead. Jake took the opportunity to catch his breath, leaning back against the wall. "So, what's the deal with that artifact you're smuggling? It's got to be pretty important if it's worth all this trouble." Lixa hesitated, her expression guarded. "It's complicated." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You're going to have to do better than that. I think I've earned at least a little honesty." She sighed, crossing her free arm over her chest. "It's an ancient piece of tech. Old, powerful, and very illegal in most parts of the galaxy. If it falls into the wrong hands, it could cause a lot of damage." "What kind of damage?" Jake pressed. "The kind that ends civilizations," Lixa said bluntly. "Happy now?" Jake's mouth went dry. "Not really." "Why are you even messing with something like that?" "Because someone has to," she said, her tone sharp. "The people I'm delivering it to can keep it out of the wrong hands. They'll make sure it doesn't destroy anyone else." Jake frowned, sensing there was more to the story, but he decided not to push. "And what happens if we don't make it?" "We'll make it," Lixa said firmly. "I've gotten out of worse situations than this." "Worse than being glued to a stranger while being chased by bounty hunters?" Jake asked skeptically. Lixa smirked. "You'd be surprised." Jake couldn't help but laugh, despite himself. "Okay, fine. I'll take your word for it. But if we survive this, you owe me a drink." Lixa rolled her eyes. "Sure. Whatever helps you sleep at night." They stepped out of the alcove and continued down the street, moving as quickly and quietly as possible. The city seemed to stretch on forever, its neon lights casting eerie reflections on the metal walls. Jake tried not to think about the bounty hunters, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As if on cue, a loud voice echoed behind them. "Targets detected. Pursuit initiated." Jake groaned. "Of course. Run!" Lixa shouted, pulling him forward. They sprinted through the streets, their awkward, tethered movements making the chase even more chaotic. Jake nearly tripped over a loose piece of debris, but Lixa yanked him back to his feet before he could fall. He didn't have time to thank her. The sound of heavy footsteps and mechanical whirring was getting closer. "Any brilliant ideas?" Jake yelled. "Working on it," Lixa shouted back. They rounded another corner and found themselves in what looked like a storage yard. Crates and barrels were stacked haphazardly, creating a maze of obstacles. Lixa pulled Jake toward one of the stacks, her glowing skin dimming as she tried to blend into the shadows. "Hide," she whispered, pressing him against the wall. Jake tried to stay as still as possible, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of the bounty hunters grew louder, their visors casting faint beams of light as they scanned the area. Jake held his breath, hoping they wouldn't notice the faint glow of Lixa's skin. The hunters paused nearby, their voices low and mechanical. Jake couldn't understand the alien language, but their tone was unmistakably menacing. He glanced at Lixa, who was staring intently at the hunters, her jaw clenched. After what felt like an eternity, the hunters moved on, their footsteps fading into the distance. Jake let out a shaky breath, his muscles relaxing slightly. "That was too close," he whispered. "No kidding," Lixa replied, her voice equally low. They stayed in the shadows for a moment longer, making sure the hunters were gone. When the coast was clear, Lixa tugged Jake forward, her movements more cautious now. They navigated the storage yard in silence, the tension between them palpable. Finally, Jake couldn't take it anymore. So, what happens if we actually make it to your ship? You've got a way to get this adhesive off, right? Lixa hesitated. Not exactly. Jake stopped in his tracks, forcing her to turn and face him. What do you mean, not exactly? I mean, the adhesive is designed to dissolve on its own after a certain amount of time, Lixa said. We just have to wait it out. Jake stared at her, his mouth falling open. Are you kidding me? How long? Lixa shrugged. Could be a few hours. Could be a few days. A few days? Jake exclaimed. I can't be stuck to you for a few days. Believe me, I'm not thrilled about it either, Lixa said dryly. But we don't have a choice. Unless you'd rather get captured and sold to the highest bidder. Jake groaned, running his free hand through his hair. This is insane. Welcome to my life, Lixa said with a smirk. Now are you done complaining, or can we keep moving? Jake sighed, resigning himself to his fate. Fine. Let's go. They continued through the storage yard, the tension between them easing slightly. Despite the chaos and the danger, Jake couldn't help but feel a strange sense of camaraderie with Lixa. She was infuriating, sure, but there was something about her that he couldn't quite put into words. For better or worse, they were in this together. And as much as Jake hated to admit it, part of him was starting to enjoy the ride. Jake didn't know what was more exhausting, running for his life or keeping pace with someone who seemed to thrive on chaos. Lixa moved like a woman possessed, her every step calculated yet maddeningly unpredictable. Jake, on the other hand, felt like an awkward sack of meat flailing in her wake, constantly being yanked forward by their adhesive bond. Can we slow down for just 1 second? He panted, nearly tripping over a loose piece of debris. Do you want to get caught? Lixa shot back without slowing down. Because I'm not keen on being turned into a science experiment today. Jake groaned but kept moving, his legs burning with the effort. You know, for someone who's supposed to be a professional, you're surprisingly bad at keeping a low profile. Excuse me? Lixa glanced at him, her glowing eyes narrowing. You've got bounty hunters chasing you, and your solution was to hide in the galaxy's busiest nightclub, Jake said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Real subtle. Lixa smirked. Hiding in plain sight works more often than you'd think. And it would have worked tonight if someone hadn't decided to stage dive. Jake opened his mouth to argue but quickly shut it when he heard the distant hum of a hovercraft. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the faint glow of lights in the distance, moving steadily closer. They've got hovercrafts now? He asked, panic rising in his voice. Fantastic. Because this wasn't stressful enough. Lixa grabbed his arm, the one not stuck to her, and pulled him toward a nearby maintenance hatch. Get in. Jake didn't need to be told twice. He squeezed through the narrow opening, wincing as his shoulder scraped against the metal frame. Lixa followed, and the hatch slammed shut behind them. The sound of the hovercraft grew louder, then gradually faded as it passed by. Jake leaned against the wall, catching his breath. Please tell me this tunnel leads to your ship. It's a maintenance route, Lixa said, her voice echoing in the confined space. It'll get us close, but we'll still have to cross the open docks. Open docks? Jake repeated, his stomach sinking. You mean out in the open where they can easily spot us? Unless you have a better idea, Lixa said, raising an eyebrow. Jake sighed. No, of course not. Let's just add it to the list of terrible ideas we're running with tonight. They started down the tunnel, their footsteps echoing in the cramped space. The adhesive made the narrow passage even more awkward, forcing them to move in a synchronized shuffle. Jake tried to ignore the growing ache in his arm and instead focused on keeping up. So, he said after a few minutes of silence, what's the plan when we get to your ship? You've got weapons, right? Some, Lixa said. But we won't need them if we're quick. The docking bay security should give us a window to take off before the bounty hunters catch up. And if they're already waiting for us? Jake asked. Lixa smirked. Then I hope you're good in a fight. Jake snorted. Define good. Great, Lixa said, rolling her eyes. We'll just wing it then. They reached the end of the tunnel and emerged into a small service corridor. The faint hum of machinery filled the air, and the metallic scent of fuel and coolant was almost overpowering. Lixa led the way, her movements tense but precise. Jake followed, trying not to think about the fact that they were walking straight into a potential ambush. He couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much worse. When they reached the docking bay, his fears were confirmed. 2 bounty hunters were stationed near the entrance, their glowing visors scanning the area. Jake froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Okay, new plan, he whispered. We turn around and find a nice, quiet hole to hide in. Not an option, Lixa said, her voice low. We have to get past them. How? Jake asked, keeping his voice down. It's not like we can just waltz through. Lixa smirked, her glow brightening slightly. Speak for yourself. Before Jake could stop her, she stepped forward, dragging him along. He barely had time to register what was happening before she started yelling. Help! He's trying to kidnap me! She shouted, her voice shrill and panicked. The bounty hunters turned, their visors locking onto the pair. Jake's eyes widened in disbelief. What are you doing? He hissed. Playing the victim, Lixa whispered back, her expression deceptively innocent. The bounty hunters approached, their weapons at the ready. One of them spoke, its voice mechanical and distorted. Explain. He grabbed me in the club and glued us together, Lixa said, her voice trembling with feigned fear. I think he's working for someone who wants the artifact. Jake's jaw dropped. Are you kidding me? You're throwing me under the bus? Lixa ignored him, her glowing eyes wide as she continued her act. Please, you have to help me. He said he'd kill me if I didn't cooperate. The bounty hunters exchanged a glance, clearly trying to process the situation. Jake, still in shock, couldn't decide whether to argue or play along. Before he could make up his mind, Lixa struck. With a fluid motion, she grabbed one of the bounty hunter's weapons and used it to knock the other one off balance. The adhesive tugged Jake forward as she moved, forcing him to duck awkwardly as she swung the weapon again. Fight back, idiot! Lixa yelled. Jake scrambled to his feet and did his best to follow her lead. He managed to grab a loose piece of piping and swung it wildly, hitting one of the bounty hunters in the side. The alien staggered, giving Lixa just enough time to disarm it completely. Within moments, both bounty hunters were on the ground, their weapons disabled. Lixa tossed the stolen weapon aside and turned to Jake, her expression smug. Not bad for a first-timer, she said. Jake stared at her, his chest heaving. You're insane. You know that, right? Maybe, Lixa said with a shrug. But we're still alive. She grabbed his arm and pulled him toward her ship, a sleek, silver vessel docked at the far end of the bay. Jake followed, his legs feeling like jelly. As they approached the ship, he couldn't help but wonder what fresh hell awaited them inside. Jake barely had time to process what had just happened before Lixa yanked him up the ramp of her ship. The adhesive bond made their ascent clumsy, with Jake nearly tripping over his own feet. The sleek interior of the ship looked deceptively calm compared to the chaos they'd just left behind, but Jake wasn't fooled. His pulse was still racing, and his breath came in quick gasps. Lixa didn't waste a second. She darted toward the cockpit, dragging Jake along. Strap in. This is going to be rough. Strap in? Jake echoed, stumbling into the co-pilot's chair. What does that even mean when I'm stuck to you? Figure it out, Lixa snapped, already flipping switches and powering up the ship. Jake fumbled with the straps, managing to secure himself just as the ship roared to life. The sudden lurch of acceleration pressed him back into his seat, and he clenched the armrests tightly. Through the viewport, the docking bay shrank as the ship lifted off. But before Jake could breathe a sigh of relief, the alarm blared. A voice crackled over the comms in an alien language, and Lixa cursed under her breath. They've locked onto us, she said, her fingers flying over the controls. Hang on. Locked on? Like missiles? Jake's voice pitched higher than he'd like, panic overtaking him. Not missiles. Tractor beams, Lixa said, gritting her teeth. Worse. The ship jolted, and Jake's stomach flipped as the vessel suddenly slowed. He glanced at the screen in front of him, which displayed a glowing beam tethering their ship to a massive cruiser. Okay, this is bad, Jake said, his voice shaking. What's the plan? Break the beam, Lixa replied, her tone clipped. Jake stared at her. How? This isn't exactly my area of expertise. You're about to learn, Lixa said. She reached under the console and pulled out a small device. Take this. Go to the engine room. There's a panel on the right side. Use this to overload the core. Jake blinked at the device, which looked suspiciously like an alien version of a wrench. Overload the core? That sounds dangerous. It is, Lixa said. But if we don't break free, they'll haul us in, and trust me, you don't want to know what happens next. Jake hesitated for half a second before unbuckling himself. Fine. Let's do this. The adhesive bond made navigating the narrow corridors of the ship a nightmare. Every time Jake tried to move in one direction, Lixa had to adjust to compensate. By the time they reached the engine room, he was sweating and cursing under his breath. Lixa pointed to the panel on the right. Open it. The controls should be. A loud crash interrupted her, and they both turned to see the bulkhead door dent inward. The bounty hunters had boarded the cruiser and were already trying to breach the ship. Work faster, Lixa snapped, shoving Jake toward the panel. Jake fumbled with the device, managing to pry the panel open. Inside, a mess of glowing wires and tubes pulsed with energy. What am I even looking at? Find the red one, Lixa said, keeping her eyes on the door. She grabbed a nearby weapon and aimed it at the bulkhead. Cut it and reverse the flow. That should destabilize the beam. Jake searched the mess of wires, his hands trembling. There's like 3 red ones. Pick one and hope for the best. Lixa yelled as the bulkhead door dented again. Jake muttered a string of curses under his breath and grabbed the closest red wire. Using the alien wrench thing, he severed the connection. Sparks flew, and the ship shuddered violently. Did it work? Jake shouted over the noise. The ship jolted again, and Lixa glanced at the screen on the wall. It's destabilizing, but not fast enough. Do it again! Jake grabbed another red wire and repeated the process. This time, the hum of the tractor beam wavered, and the ship lurched forward slightly. It's working! Lixa called, firing a shot at the bulkhead as it buckled further. One more! Jake reached for the last red wire, his heart pounding. Just as he severed it, the ship gave a deafening groan, and the beam released. Lixa let out a triumphant yell, spinning around and dragging Jake back toward the cockpit. We're clear! She shouted, throwing herself into the pilot's seat. Jake collapsed into the co-pilot's chair, his chest heaving. I can't believe that worked. Lixa smirked, her hands flying over the controls. Told you. Now sit tight while I get us out of here. The ship shot forward, leaving the cruiser and its tractor beam behind. Jake slumped back in his seat, his head spinning. He couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him drained and more than a little shaken. Lixa glanced at him, her smirk softening into something almost resembling a smile. Not bad for a first-timer. Jake snorted. Yeah, I'll add intergalactic fugitive to my resume. They lapsed into a brief silence, the hum of the ship's engines the only sound. For the first time since the night had started, Jake felt like he could finally catch his breath. So, he said after a moment, what happens now? Lixa shrugged, her glowing eyes fixed on the stars ahead. Now we get as far away from here as possible. After that? Who knows? Jake frowned. What about the adhesive? You said it would dissolve eventually. It will, Lixa said, a mischievous glint in her eye. In the meantime, I guess you're stuck with me. Jake groaned, but he couldn't help the small smile tugging at his lips. Lucky me. Lixa chuckled, the sound surprisingly warm. Don't get used to it, human. As soon as this bond dissolves, you're on your own. Fair enough, Jake said, leaning back in his seat. But until then, you might as well tell me your real plan. Something tells me there's more to this than you're letting on. Lixa raised an eyebrow, her smirk returning. Maybe. But if I told you everything, where's the fun in that? Jake laughed, shaking his head. You're impossible. And you're still here. Lixa shot back, her tone teasing. Jake couldn't argue with that. For better or worse, he was in this now. And as much as he hated to admit it, part of him was starting to enjoy the chaos.